Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode. Today, I'm delighted to introduce a special guest, Nigel Walter, a distinguished expert in architectural conservation. As the founding director of Archangel and a specialist conservation architect, Nigel has dedicated 3 decades to community-based architecture, significantly influencing the strategic direction of his practice. His innovative thinking and positive social impact were recognised in 2018 when he was honoured with a REBA Fellowship. Nigel is also a prolific contributor to the field, regularly writing, speaking and teaching on conservation topics. He's a valued member of the Association for Project Management, a DCMS nominated member of the Church Buildings Council, and a REBA Conservation Accreditation Assessor. Furthermore, his global engagements include active participation in 2 ICOMOS International Scientific Committees for places of religion and ritual, and theory and philosophy of conservation and restoration. So I really hope you enjoy today's episode. So, Nigel, welcome. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. It's great to join you, Vincent. Yes, thank you.
So, how did it all start for you? What was your background, and were you interested in this from from when you left school and into university? Did you have a clear vision of what you wanted to do and, becoming an architect? And tell me a bit about your background.
Thank you. I'm not somebody who, was born a conservation architect, to put it that way. My route into architecture was through doing art. I assumed I would become an engineer, and then I found myself really enjoying art at school, and particularly I was doing art A level, majoring in ceramics. And there's something about the tactile experience of forming clay into something, and the hazard of the firing process and all of that, which is just magical. And I ended up deciding to do a design course at university, which was architecture. So I sort of went into it without much of an idea about buildings or much of an interest in buildings, actually. And obviously grew that interest in the sort of process of being formed into an architect. The move into being into focusing on conservation, which I now do, is something that came along later, so perhaps a relatively unusual. So I was probably in my mid-40s when I had been working on some church projects just because I knew some people who needed work doing to churches. And so we had some church work within the practice. And then I realized if we were going to do churches properly, I needed to I needed to own the conservation bit rather than trying to buy it in through employing people to do it. So I went and did a master's at York in conservation. And really that was about trying to get accreditation, a sort of proper way of moving towards conservation accreditation. But it was a whole lot more interesting than I expected it to be. So, and I think that was because it was at York, the Conservation Masters is situated within the archaeology department alongside, cultural heritage management, buildings archaeology, a whole load of other things which you have to choose other modules to do alongside your conservation modules. And that opened me up to a whole different world, which I thought I've got something to contribute here. And so I came back a couple of years after finishing the master's to do a PhD, much to my surprise, really. Went through doing the PhD while running the practice at the same time, and came out the other end of that. And as a result of the PhD, which is, I mean, all of these things, I think of them in some sense as sort of tokens of authority. It sort of opens the door to doing other things. So you find yourself being asked to join committees or applying for things and sort of getting appointed to things. So I'm now in a position. So the PhD finished 8 years ago, and I'm on I'm on quite a few sort of different committees, the Church Buildings Council, for example, and some subcommittees of that. I'm a trustee of the National Churches Trust, and all of that sort of flows from having dipped into the academic world and opened
Yeah.
up that strand alongside practice. Um, and even while I was doing the academic stuff, I came to realize that the being holding those two things together um, is a really fertile place to be. That it kind of is where I realize, this is what I'm meant to be doing, kind of sort of feeling. You know how you just occasionally
Mm.
get that in life. It was that sort of thing. And just pragmatically, the people in academia who see somebody who's in practice, they think, wow, that's amazing. And the people in practice who see somebody in academia think, oh, that's amazing. And so holding the two together, you can sort of you can, in the horrible business terms, leverage it, in the
Yeah.
and yeah, there's a magic in bringing those things together, I find. So.
Mm. And what was the practical element like at York? What did that entail?
For example, I mean, and the classic thing, you go and do some line pointing. You all go
Mm.
somewhere. There's a farm building that has sort of suffered from many generations of firstly neglect, and then secondly many generations of students coming along and doing a bit of sort of amateur line pointing. The sort of line, there was a line day, I seem to remember. There was also in looking at structures. So at the time there was a lot of work going on York Minster. So going up on the scaffold at York Minster and sort of seeing the stuff close up, really, really, really helpful. Um, and also sort of a little bit on timber structures, for example. Um,
Mm.
but it's not like it was all hands on. There was also the sort of a lot of focus on the theoretical context of conservation in terms of charters and processes, and through the cultural heritage management stuff verging more into the philosophy of this stuff, and philosophers, actual philosophers, instead of what passes for philosophy in conservation, which is there's that great book, and it's a really good book by John Earl called something like Philosophy of Conservation, something like that. Um,
Okay.
that was the first book I bought in preparing to do the um, masters, and I think I've never been more disappointed in such a good book, if that makes sense. It's a really good book in its own right, but it's horrendously missold by talking about philosophy. There is no mention of any philosopher anywhere in that book. So to me, the title of the book would imply, and this is going to connect you to philosophical questions in other walks of life and actual philosophers who've talked about stuff that is relevant, because there's some really interesting questions in philosophy that are very pertinent to heritage, like identity through change. That's a whole kind of
Mm.
do things stay the same when they change? It's the I don't know whether you heard of the ship of Theseus so Plutarch has this thing about so Theseus, so having been off on his journeys, his ship is in dry dock and they start replacing bits, because it needs maintenance, as any wooden ship would need maintenance. So as soon as you replace a plank, is that the same ship or is it not the same ship? And then when
Mm.
you've replaced all the planks, is it still the same ship? Or,
Yeah.
is there a point at which it ceases to be the same ship? So, in your world with timber structures, or indeed with, the temples in sort of China and Korea and Japan, that get rebuilt,
Mm.
it speaks to the same sort of dilemma. That's a profoundly philosophical question, which the way conservation is generally dealt with in Britain, we kind of just ignore, which I think is much to our
Mm.
detriment.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, we're gonna discuss this in a bit more depth
Mm.
in a minute. But when you did your masters, you did your PhD, and then you already had your practice. So was
Yes.
your goal at the outset to run your own practice? Was that firmly in your mind? This is what I need to do, or did you have options to maybe work at another practice and not
Mhm.
have the stress of
Mhm. Mhm.
running a business?
Yeah. So the small business thing. So when I started out in architecture, I came into I finished my diploma, so I wasn't yet quite an architect. So that was the professional part two in 1991, which is a
Okay.
terrible, terrible time to come onto the architectural marketplace. I did manage to get a job, which lasted a year and a bit and saw me qualified, and then got made redundant, and got a just 3 weeks work with a small practice, a guy who had been up to half a dozen people and down to just himself and was just needed a little bit of help. And that 3 weeks turned into 4 years in the end, which was great. But what I learned from that was I really don't want to run a practice. That's, kind of that's really scary. Um, and so I left that and did a completely different sort of job. I worked for Lloyd's TSB. Can you believe it? Doing stuff to bank branches. Um, so
What? Still architecture?
yeah, yeah.
Oh yeah. Okay.
They had but architecture were very, sort of financial and surveyory
Yeah.
sort of thing. Which, I mean, it fundamentally it was was a pay rise and a progression, in the context of having a young family and needing to put bread on the table and all of that sort of stuff. So I did that for about 4 years, and then struck out on my own. That was in 2000 when I was about 35. And so I went from thinking I'm never going to run a practice. It's kind of that's scary,
Yeah.
and who would pay me? But ultimately, I had a really interesting moment when I was cutting a big piece of timber, and you know how when you're doing manual work, your brain is working in a different way.
Mm.
And as clear as anything into my mind came this question, because I'd been thinking about, could I set up a practice? And clear as anything was this question, so what are you afraid of? And that was very simple once the question had been put. What I was afraid of was that I wasn't good enough to,
Okay.
run a practice. And then that sort of framing it like that gave me the courage to actually do it. And I was able to set up the practice and still work the day job for about 10 months, which meant that when I actually gave up the day job, there was a little bit of money in the practice. And it's gone from there. Initially, very modest domestic sort of stuff, and specializing in whatever came through the door, as it were.
Yeah.
Um, and then gradually it's grown. We took over somebody else's practice. So it went from myself plus two to myself plus four and then five. And that each stage sort of led to a different thing. But the decision to take the conservation seriously, as it were, came sort of 10 years after having started the practice.
Mm.
So it wasn't, having said to myself, I'll never run a practice. Don't want to do that. I certainly didn't want to do conservation. That was nowhere in my mind. And I certainly didn't want to work with churches, which is what I now find myself doing almost all the time. So it's
Oh.
it's it's funny what you promise yourself, and then
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah. And what were those early days like when you ran your practice? You built up enough work to then
Mhm.
transition,
Yeah,
and then did you at the time you had sort of obviously probably financial commitments like mortgages and
yeah,
that type of
absolutely.
thing.
Yeah,
So what were those early days like? And you probably couldn't cherry pick the work. You probably just
no,
had to take whatever came through the door.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
But what was it like? Was it, did you have moments where it was very stressful and you wondered what you'd done and where the next bit of work was coming from? Or did it just naturally flow and
Um,
build?
I mean, one's memory probably becomes selective after 20 years, whatever.
Yeah.
Um, I don't remember. So I certainly remember it being stressful in terms of, it can become all absorbing, and the thing with, it being associated with home and work has always been attached to my house. It's always been out of the house, um, but it's always been attached to the house, and therefore, for some people that's impossible to, you just don't have the division between the two which you need in order to stay sane and remain a sort of remain human and have relationships outside of work. For me, I mean, my wife might sort of say, oh, kind of it was a bit different to what I remember, but it was never, I was never in this. So it was, yes, stressful in terms of the amount of work. And I used to, when I was sort of doing everything, including sort of running all the jobs, then I remember some summers where, you would go away, but, kind of what would happen when you weren't there. So that's all to do with delegation and having appropriately qualified people to make decisions in your absence.
Mm,
One of the things that I realized fairly early on, was that, um, the mechanics of business was really important to the success of being an architect, being a good architect, put it that way. Lots of
mm,
architects and people in similar sort of things, sort of, um, well, at least the way I grew up as an architect professionally in terms of training, the idea that you would be interested in business was sort of beneath one, the mechanics of business, and and I realized that to me anyway, it was really helpful to frame the business as itself a design task. So you could design a business well so that it was at least could keep its head above water and you didn't have to worry about the money. Or you could design it badly, just not think about it properly and be really stressed by it and actually not do a good job. You let clients down. And that means that's bad in all sorts of ways. Um,
mm,
not least in terms of reputation, which is your number one asset. It's your reputation comprising relationships and completed projects. That's where the value of a service, company is, that's what you need to guard as much as possible.
mm,
It's reputation. And good reputation flows from consistently doing a good job. So the whole thing of, being able to systematize. So for a number of years, I had, business coaching, which again, is kind of that's a kind of completely different language and something that lots of architects would be very suspicious of. But actually, really, really important, I think, to
mm,
ending up with a business. So the aim was never to make loads of money. The aim has been to make enough money to have choices, to have choices as to what I do. And, I have managed to gather into the company, which is called Archangel, people who are seem delighted to stay. So we're currently a team of six. Of the other five, apart from one who was hired, 2.5 years ago, everybody's been with us more than 10 years.
mm,
And Dirk, who's the other director, 20 years. And that is that's hugely satisfying to think that people want to stay.
yes. Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
that's something, and I somehow that tracks back to having designed the thing as a coherent business.
Yeah.
Um,
Did you say that you're running your practice from your house?
yes,
Yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because it's sometimes nice to escape from work.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I've worked from home on the odd day or so, and it's nice in some respects, but then it's also quite nice for me to come down to my workshop and escape. And
mhm,
then I come back from
mhm.
the workshop and, well, actually I come back to my house and I look at it and think, oh my God, I've got to do all this,
Yes,
all
yes.
this maintenance and all this work. So it's a little bit too close to my actual day job.
Mm,
But yeah, but it's an interesting one because either people can cope with working from home, or
mhm.
it's too, you get cabin fever too much because you're in your building. But did you have a separate a separate office or an outbuilding?
So from the outset, so the initial condition, as it were, was there was a room on the back of the garage that I converted into an
uh
office, which could only ever be an office for one. It's nice space, but it could only ever be for one. There wasn't space for a second desk. Um, and then, we must have moved a couple of years after I set up the practice to somewhere that had the ability to expand. And then we did quite a lot of work to the house, within a couple of years. So
mm,
we've got the office comprises a sort of a studio space with six desks. and photocopier, plotter, etc. And that's upstairs. And I'm talking to you from a meeting room which accommodates maximum 8 people. So there's that, and then there's the normal sort of, there's a little refreshments area and whatever. So it
Oh,
um,
lovely.
we were lucky enough to, and the way this house works, it's we'll come on perhaps to talk about buildings as narrative, but I think of this building as having an extended narrative. It's I'm sitting in what used to be an apple store in an orchard, just a little brick shed, single story rectangular thing. And it then got turned into a worker's cottage with some stuff added up above, which is where the office is. And then in the 60s, an architect couple actually built themselves a rectangular bungalow alongside it, so 2 houses on one very big plot. And then the previous owners to us joined the two together into a single house. And then we came along and did a whole load of additions at sort of first floor and stuff. And because of the genesis of the way it was initially a worker's cottage and then another house next to it, it divides very well into 2 parts. So the one
Mm.
part is basically now the office, and the other part is domestic world, and there's a door between them, and go freely between them. But there is enough separation. It's not like kind of stepping out of your bedroom and into the study on the landing, type thing, which I would find difficult. That there
Yes.
should
Yeah,
be
yeah, yeah.
some mental distinction, I think.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's very, very important. And those in those early days, because you have to make mistakes in business, don't you, to learn?
Yeah.
And it's not a mistake if you learn from it. It's just a learning curve. That's what
Yeah.
that's what I say. What would you say that some of the early mistakes that you made, either taking on too much work and not being able to deliver, or did you make a few mistakes, or did your business coaching keep you,
Mhm.
on that path where you had everything sort of in control? You didn't make too many mistakes.
Who knows? It's parallel realities. I don't look back and wring my hands and think, oh my goodness, if only I had been, known about that thing, then the world would be completely different. It's not, so there's not sort of any sort of huge fork in the road in the way I look back and see it. I think the bits that I regret are not being bold enough, perhaps. I should have
Uh,
probably been bolder in
okay.
reaching out to people. I'm basically an introvert, with some extrovert and dramatic tendencies, but basically an introvert. And
Mm.
as an introvert, it's kind of very easy to sort of hunker down and focus on the task and not do enough talking to people. So
Yes.
there's a bit of there's and indeed, in now that it's not only me as a director, Dirk, one of the things I love about Dirk is he's just very, very personable and very, happy to go seeking people out and talking to people, and that's really good. And that's where you get, you make up. When you're on your own, you kind of have to try and cover all bases. And then when you've got a
Mm.
bit more of a team, you can afford to play to a bit more to your strengths. And that's the situation we're now in, which is, I think, very helpful and
Yeah,
healthy.
that sounds great. And it is difficult, isn't it? Because when you're a business owner and you're a sole director, you can't help being a bottleneck in the business, because
Exactly.
you
Yeah.
can't, you're wearing so many hats,
Yes.
and you're not going to be strong in a few of those areas.
Yeah.
So it's it sounds like this is a great for you, because you've been able to gather this team of fantastic people,
Mm.
and it enables you to do what you're best at.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's great. It's
There's I don't know whether you've come across it. The first book that the business coach guy I used to see gave me to read was a thing called The E-Myth Revisited.
Oh no, I don't know that. I'm going to write that
Okay.
down.
There's a guy, I think it's Michael Gerber is the author. It's a classic for small businesses and business coaching and stuff like that. And basically the thrust of it is, well, this is, not doing it justice, but the observation that, the way in which people start businesses, the people who start businesses basically often have a technical skill that they're good at. That you're a good architect, you're a good furniture restorer, you're a good decorator, whatever, because you're good, you start your own business.
Mm,
And because you're good, you get more work. Work finds its way to you, so you prosper and you get more work, and then you get more work because you're good and you get some, good referrals. But if it's just you still doing it, then you end up, sort of chasing your tail and dropping a ball every now and again. And that then the sort of quality then suffers because you're letting people down because you're too busy. And you end up in a if you don't do the if you don't find some way appropriate to your setting of delegating, you either have to be really disciplined in terms of limiting how much you're going to take on,
mm,
or you will fall apart essentially. And the falling apart sometimes takes the form of, you gather lots of work, so you're doing lots of work, so you're not doing any selling. You need to be doing and selling in
mm,
balance, all the time in order to be able to grow in a controlled sort of way. So the one classic sort of mistake is that you do, and then you find you've got no work, and then you sell, and then you bring in some more work, but you haven't had any income. So it's sort of a stop-start sort of thing. And there are an awful lot of really good businesses, really good potential businesses that fail because they don't understand the mechanics of business. That they're really good at their technical skill, but they
mm.
don't understand what is now required of them, which is a different or a complement, something to be added to that basic technical skill. So looking beyond one's technical skill, what makes one special is essential to thriving as a business, really, and or
Yeah,
indeed not being eaten by it.
it's
Yeah.
interesting, isn't it? Because my case, for instance, I was thinking this the other day. I don't know why I had this urge to become self-employed.
Mm,
I've no idea. I don't know why. There wasn't at one moment where I thought, "Oh, great, this is my journey." It just sort of happened for me.
mm,
But I think I'm not alone in saying that it's very, very easy to start to, there are many, many different skills that you need to run your own business. There are, multiple skills. You can't just be a fantastic antique furniture restorer.
yeah,
You've got to be good with clients. You've got to know the
yeah,
office work and invoicing, and how you're going to your cash flow. I mean, there's just
yeah,
multiple
yeah,
things that you have to learn.
yeah,
Now, I think with my case, for instance, is that I had to learn all of these different facets that made, how to run a business, and still not completely understanding what business was. I didn't quite understand what a business was. I was very good at the marketing and the doing and the
mm,
promotion, but not
mm,
so much on the
mm,
business side.
mhm,
However, what happens is as you go along, you'll learn these areas, small amount here, small amount there, and you'll gather, and then you're running your business. However, you don't realize that there are certain aspects that you shouldn't be doing and you're weak at.
mm,
But,
mhm, mhm,
but you don't know any better because
mm,
that's what you're doing.
mm,
You're just running your
mm,
business. And it takes a long time to realize, I'm strong there. I'm not so
mm.
good there.
Yeah,
And that then needs to be delegated to
yes,
someone else,
yes,
But you're
yes,
right in saying, I think too many people go down that route
mm,
and then it fails because either they're
mm,
burning out or,
yes,
it's just not sustainable.
yes, yes,
And they don't. It's funny. There are a few people I had on this
mm,
show about another two guests. I think had mentors or business coaches,
right,
and it's something that I didn't have in the early days.
mm,
And me looking back now, I wish I'd explored that, but nobody said to me, "Oh, yeah, you're good at what you do. You're good with the
mm,
clients. You can sell. You're a good restorer.
mm,
However,
mm,
you've got to understand this and this."
yes,
And
yes,
I think think anybody listening to this that is thinking of starting their own practice, I think that's essential, isn't it, to get a really good business coaching or a good mentor on
yeah,
board
yeah,
at the
yeah.
early days.
I think so. And yeah, mentoring in sort of two dimensions, I suppose. One, if you're able to find somebody of a generous spirit who's in
Mm,
the industry who will mentor
yes.
you.
Yeah.
And often actually that translates into referring of bits of work, which can be absolute gold dust. And that was certainly the case with me. One or two other architects in Cambridge in the early years would send me stuff that they just didn't have the capacity for. And some of that, I mean, apart from keeping the thing afloat, but some of them actually turned into quite important relationships for the business. So that was really good. And then the other type of mentorship is somebody who is not in the business, not in your industry at all, and can do what you're describing, which is give a sort of overview,
Mm.
look at you from the outside without knowing about your particular discipline, and tell you what's missing from a slightly more, I suppose, abstract business sort of point. No, but the key thing, I mean, what I would be saying to anybody watching this who is thinking about starting business, start with a book like The E-Myth Revisited, because there's a lot that gives you and for some people it will be obvious. Somebody, for example, who has grown up, whose parents have been self-employed,
Mm.
probably they've absorbed quite a lot of that stuff. They'll have a feel for it, even if they don't realize it. But I mean, that wasn't the case with me. I don't know about you, but I had no idea about business, and
No, same
that,
here.
so
Yeah.
so finding a book like The E-Myth is just a really good grounding, and then it'll give you some of the right questions to ask. Indeed, might give you some of the questions to ask when you're looking for a mentor. Because you don't want just anybody. You want somebody who will will perform the role well for you. Um, and
Mm.
I mean, the whole thing about the thrust of the book is about systematizing. So there's a whole lot of what we do which is repetitive, and then there's the sort of magic beans in what I would term. So and the I seem to remember that the book talks about McDonald's, for example, as a case of systematization. It's a business built on, systematization, which enables a 15-year-old to, serve a burger in a whatever. So their business model is, they've got systematization down to a T. Now, I don't want to be McDonald's. Either literally, I don't want to do burgers, and I don't want to be anything like McDonald's. But the key learning is absolutely applicable, I think, to any business. That if you don't, the danger is if you don't systematize, you will never grow well, because you'll be wasting so much effort in delivering actually a suboptimal result. Because the thing with systematization is you get consistency. It's two things. You get
Mm.
consistency, and you are able to delegate on the basis of something that's been systematized. Now, there's a whole lot about, I imagine, your job and my job, which can't be systematized, and that's the, sort of the judgment and the creativity and, whatever it
Yeah,
might be. But there's an awful lot that can be. And if you don't systematize the stuff that can be systematized, you never get enough time to do the creative stuff, which is what you
exactly.
want to be doing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's such a good point because there is a huge amount that you can systematize.
Yeah.
And if you do that, then, and that's something that I haven't done in the past. I'm putting my hand up, I'm guilty. I have
Mm,
not done that because I'm this creative person
mm,
that will just think, oh, that's a great idea. I'm going to go and do that. And I'm going to speak to that person and win this work. And
mm,
that's and then in the meantime, there are no systems in place. So
mm,
therefore, that then leads to just chaos.
yeah. Yeah. It
and
can do. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, and then it builds up, doesn't it? Then you haven't got anything, and yeah, it's something that I unfortunately had to learn late on in my business
Mm,
career.
mm,
But it's a really, really, really good. That's a valid
mm,
point. So, Nigel, let's talk
mm,
about your work and what really makes you tick and get
mm,
up in the morning, and what's your area that you
mm,
absolutely love.
Okay. Thank you. So I would say living heritage,
Okay.
by which I mean, so I'm talking about physical heritage, tangible heritage, buildings, and specifically buildings that are used for the purposes for which they were built generally, or are thoroughly in use. And going back to my entry into conservation, um, it started from finding myself working with some churches, and as I said, then wanting to do the thing properly and sort of add the conservation bit. And the thing with churches, I mean, the regulation of the permission system in Britain is quite unusual internationally, in that we have this separate system called the ecclesiastical exemption,
Mm,
which we can talk more about. But um, my view of the so some people love it and some people hate it. Those that hate it think that it's the church marking its own homework. It's, why should the church be able to kind of do stuff? And there's a worry about the church getting away with horrible things that shouldn't be allowed to happen. Um, I would characterize there being a basic division between an understanding of conservation as preservation. And in that context, change should be avoided if at all possible, and if it's not possible, then kept to a minimum. And the sort of poster children for that would be William Morris with the SPAB Manifesto in 1877, John Ruskin, basically. Though he's an interesting case because he had more of an understanding of what churches were for in terms of people. Thomas Hardy came along as a younger generation of SPAB, and said very much the same thing in an address in 1906. Basically, they are ignoring, sidelining call it the people of the parish, the people who actually use the building, and almost seeing them as the enemy. And that translates into an attitude that I come across in conservation sometimes, in the permissions process, where the people of the parish are treated as sort of useful idiots who are willing to keep the show on the road, but really shouldn't be listened to. They shouldn't get to do what they want to do with their building. Now, clearly, the test shouldn't only be what the people of the parish want to do with their building, the non-professionals, because they might want to do some things that are completely inappropriate. But they should have a voice at the table, because I would see so the living heritage thing, as opposed to the preservation bit, the living heritage, an understanding of something like a church being living heritage, is an understanding that the people are as much a part of the current generation of people who live in the building, as it were, and work the building and pay for the upkeep of the building, are as much a part of the heritage as the physical stuff. And that's a really difficult thing for somebody of a preservationist mind to accept. But I
mm,
think it is absolutely so. To me, the heritage that we are tasked as conservation professionals with maintaining and passing on to the next generation isn't just the beautiful, medieval building that we might be dealing with, or whatever age, nor is it, as some people might argue in critical heritage studies type thing, potentially, that it's just the people. Everything is intangible, and it's just the people that are important. To me, it's the interlocking of those two, and it's not just sort of one plus one makes two. It's an amalgam. It's something inseparable to me, and it's at that joining together, the nexus, the binding together. That's where the heritage is, and anything that we do that loosens that binding together is bad for heritage. And if you look at it in that way, I would say quite a lot of what we do as a system as a whole is bad for the heritage, because quite a lot of it serves ultimately to defeat to do that sort of separation by making it difficult to live with these buildings, because it's very, very, very easy to say no to, as a permission giver, you can find 1,001 reasons to say no,
mm.
or delay, and hope that it goes away. Just make it, throw sand into the gears, make it difficult. All of that is bad for heritage, because it's loosening that link between the people and the place.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
ultimately, I suppose you had, I really liked your interview that you had with Tobit Curtis, who said something like, not a quote, but something like, the least well preserved building, least well conserved building is the building nobody visits.
Yeah, I know, I love
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Now,
very
I
true.
would absolutely, I listen to that and say, yes, absolutely. That's absolutely where I'm coming from. I would put it in the same sentiment in a slightly different way, slightly more assertive, perhaps, which is to say that it's only the buildings that are used that will survive.
Mm,
If we make the use of the building, which implies changing them within limits, but that change should be on the agenda. If we make change difficult, we make use difficult, and we ultimately consign the building to being lost. And that's not a good result for anyone. If you take a 100-year, 200-year horizon, which we should be, not the 6-month horizon or the year horizon or the 5-year horizon.
Going back to the different, so churches have different rules and regulations. Can you explain the difference between, your classic listed building and a church? And yeah, that would be great.
So yeah, great. So specialist subject, love it. So if you have let's say you live in a listed farmhouse, and you want to change anything about it, within almost anything about it, you get permission for that change through listed building consent, which is administered as part of the planning system, and that's dealt with through the local authority. So local authorities should have conservation officers. They don't always, they sometimes buy that in. There are fewer conservation officers than there used to be, but basically it's done through the local authority planning system. Churches have what's termed, there's an umbrella term, which is the ecclesiastical exemption. And that's exemption from the need to get local authority listed building consent. And instead of local authority listed building consent, in England, 5 denominations have the right to have their own systems of listed building consent. And those are the Church of England, the Roman Catholic Church, the Baptists, the Methodists, and the United Reformed Church, which that covers almost all, not quite all, but almost all of the listed church buildings in use. So ecclesiastical exemption only applies to buildings still in use for worship. So if you have a listed church and it closes and it becomes a pub, that then goes into the secular system, as it were. So it's only church buildings in use. There's the last refresh of the legislation was in 2010, and it's secondary legislation. It's an order as opposed to an act of parliament, and there's some guidance that was written at the same time, which is it's only about 35 pages. It's worth reading if you're interested in the subject, because there's a great paragraph in there that talks about why we have the ecclesiastical exemption system at all, and it points out two things. Firstly, that basically, these are my words, not what's written, but basically, it's if this all were to revert to the secular system couldn't cope. There's just far too much there. And then secondly, that there's something distinct about churches, which I would put in terms of living buildings, that means that they should be able to change in order to stay in use. And that's in this guidance, which is a really important little marker. And it's just a surprisingly sort of living buildings literate sort of bit of writing there in the official guidance. And then underneath that umbrella, which the order sets up that just sets up the possibility for such systems, there are these 5 systems from the denominations, of which the Anglican system, the Church of England system, which is the faculty system, is by far the largest and the most developed, because the Anglicans have the great majority of the listed buildings, and the great majority of the grade 1 and 2 stars, which are very crudely, if it's medieval, it's probably grade 1 or grade 2 star. And then there are other grade 1 churches that are not of that age. Some Victorian ones, for example. There's a great one in Cambridge, which actually is now no longer in use, but a Bodley Church, All Saints on Jesus Lane, which is a fantastic building. But they are those buildings get treated under this system. Now, the faculty system is organized by diocese. So each diocese has a judge who's called a chancellor, and they have an advisory committee, the Diocesan Advisory Committee, or DAC, who has the job of both liaising with the churches who are wanting to make these, a given change or whatever, and the statutory consultees, so the six amenity societies, Historic England, um, and sort of listening to all of that, and then as a group coming to a recommendation to the Chancellor. The recommendation can be, in favour or against, or no recommendation. There's a sort of abstention option in the middle. And
Mm.
then the Chancellor looks at the evidence that's put forward both by the church in terms of a statement of significance and a statement of needs. So the statement of significance is about why the thing is important in the first place and the different aspects that are important. And the statement of needs is the core of that is spelling out the benefits that are achieved by the proposed change. So we're able to do community outreach in this building if we can take out some of the pews, that type of thing. So demonstrating why that's important. We've got sort of 150 new houses coming to the village, and those sorts of concerns. And then it's a very simple, that the core of the process is very simple as a weighing up of what the secular legislation terms harm to significance, which basically means the degree of change. Harm is an unfortunate phrase, but that's what's in the NPPF, for example, versus the public benefit. So the Chancellor, their job, the judge, the decision maker, is weighing those two things up. Has the church demonstrated sufficient benefit to justify the degree of change? That's the way this is. And
Okay.
if the answer is yes, you get your permission, and if the answer is no, you don't. So it's simple in that sense.
So, very similar rules and regulation, just done in a different way, different format.
Yeah.
Now, so question I have, let's say we have a period property owner that has purchased their property and they want to carry out various changes that are quite potentially removing some original material from the building. However, if they don't do it, the property is going to go to rack and ruin. Nobody else is going to buy it because it's in such a state of disrepair. And then we have church that is struggling to get a congregation every week, and they need to modernize and take out some pews that date back to the 1600s or something like that. But however, it's essential for the church's survival. If you were the property owner or the owner of the church, which one of those, very difficult, but which one of those would be easier, would you say, to implement those changes? I think I know what you're going to say, but it's because they're both living heritage. If somebody's living in a house and for it to survive, have to make these changes. It's a difficult one and it's complicated, but
So, okay, I would observe two differences. One is in the house owner's case. So the question, who is the gatekeeper to the permission? In the first case, it's effectively the local authority conservation officer.
yeah.
I mean, that they don't get to decide, but effectively they do. Or 9 times out of 10, there's the possibility of the planning committee going against their advice. But basically, they are the person who are sort of judge and jury in most cases. And then on the other hand, with the church system, you've got far more nuanced input actually as to there's far more attention paid to changes to churches because of this in the Anglican system, the DAC structure or equivalent within other denominations. What I would observe is that in the secular case, the house owner, it can often be easier to convince people that it's this change or it's disaster type thing, and therefore the change is acceptable, than at least some of the amenity societies, for example, are willing to grant with respect to a church. I think that because a church that is proposing change of that sort is still a going concern, there's not the kind of if we don't allow this, the thing's going to close. There's just an assumption if we don't allow this, oh, they'll carry on. Of course, they'll carry on. They've been doing it for 700 years.
Yeah.
So there's a
Yeah.
sort of, I would say, a complacency, and
Yes.
turning it around, a sort of refusal to look to the future in a creative way. So that comes to the conservatism of a lot of conservation. That kind of yeah, there's an assumption that it'll be fine because and the church are only saying that because they want to do it, and they and just sort of not understanding how a church works as an organism. So coming back to your earlier question about what sort of what fires me up, it's about negotiating that interface between a church community and their needs, which I have a feel for because I belong to a church, and I kind of speak church if church is a language. But the interface between that and what is a really complex permission system, and equipping a church to be able to navigate it without getting too hurt by it, because
Mm.
it can be a very bruising process. Um, so, which of the two is easier, the church or the well? Again, with your example, if they were 16th century pews or whatever, you would be doing everything you possibly could to avoid having to remove those
Mm.
pews. So you might be often it's those pews are there are elements of 16th century work within something that has been reworked. So it's sort of it's more like dealing with a kit of parts. Just in my experience. So there's a project that we've got on at the moment in for um, uh, a large church, village church, Grade 1 listed in a village called Bassingbourne in South Cambridgeshire. And that had so we've succeeded in taking out most of the pews, which were Victorian and of a pretty standard design, and not by a named architect, and in softwood, and the material wasn't in great condition. So all of those add to the overall picture as to justifying why
Mm.
change is appropriate, alongside the positive things about what the church were wanting to use the building for. So the majority of the pews being removed, but the retention of some of so there were some in the side aisles which had, again, had medieval material, late medieval material, which clearly you don't want to be getting rid of those. So I've never been in
No.
a situation where you have to start talking about kind of taking out the medieval pews. I don't know of anywhere that's been done, and I would, have to be very brave to sort of be suggesting that, just because they're so much rarer. But in principle, yeah, absolutely, the argument could go that far that if it's a choice between that and the building being
I
abandoned,
know.
then
Isn't it? It's so difficult, isn't it? I
yeah,
mean, I would hate to be in a position where I have to make the decision
yeah,
for
yeah,
that.
yeah,
Can you imagine?
yeah.
Then that must be so, so difficult. Now, another question I've got for you, I've just been
Hmm.
thinking about while you've been talking is, I don't know what sort of rapidly or more of a decline pubs or churches over the last
Hmm.
10 to 10, 15 years,
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
they both seem to be in a lot of trouble.
Hmm.
And from talking about churches, what's the reason, would you say?
Okay, so the answer to the question is an easy one. Far, far more pubs have been closing than churches. It's much more common for the church to find itself as the last one standing in terms of community
Mm,
facilities in a given
yeah.
settlement. That doesn't mean the church is healthy, but in the long term, in terms of people, in terms of numbers of people, there is an aging demographic. It plays out differently in different places. And the overall negative story does need to be balanced by, actually, in some places the church is in really good health. And interestingly, if you look at the statistics, there seems to be something going on with 18 to 24-year-olds, that they're coming back to church, which is really interesting. And they're willing to give. There's interesting research. There's an organization called Stewardship, which does research, commissions research into giving patterns in churches. And that demographic, in terms of proportion of income, that demographic, 18 to 24s, are far more generous than any other thing, including, your demographic, my demographic, the retired people, that it's the young people that, and that's, hugely impressive. So it's not all doom and gloom, but
Mm.
it's undoubtedly the case that we've got a huge number of churches, and if you were designing a system, if you could plonk down those, if you could distribute those buildings, because the Church of England has approximately 16,000 parish churches. And one of the unique things, in the Church of England is there's a church for every settlement, kind of. I mean, it's almost, sort of universal provision. Um, in some places like, rural Norfolk, what that looks like is, you know, six, eight, 10 churches run by a single clergy person with
Yeah.
some, lay help. And that's just not, that's not sustainable. And similarly, the sort of age of people in quite a number of those churches, the demographic is getting older, and is not being replaced in quite the same way. There's also an interesting thing. I mean, churches have always worked on the basis of volunteer labor, and that's true in terms of the running of the thing. People coming forward to be church warden, for example. Um, and that has changed. There are more people entering retirement who find themselves with other responsibilities. For example, childcare for the next generation, which, sort of 40, 50 years ago wasn't the case. 40, 50 years ago, when you retired, you had time on your hands, because the next generation, they weren't both working in quite the same
Mm.
way as it is now. So the amount of volunteer time seems to be declining. There's also just historically, particularly with rural community, the maintenance to the building was often done on before we had widespread use of cement. It would be very common for, out of season for agricultural labor to be doing some maintenance on the church. And lime is, an easy material to you can't go too far wrong with lime. As long as you don't hurt yourself, you understand that it's caustic. But that's how these buildings stayed, with the wheels on and, sort of trundling along merrily. And so there's something that's changing about volunteer capacity. And SPAB had a little while ago, great program of faith in maintenance. So there are attempts to sort of encourage more engagement on a sort of maintenance basis, with church buildings. Yeah, so it's not, is it Mark Twain, the reports of my death are somewhat exaggerated, or, whatever he said. The death of the church has been predicted many, many times. Um,
Mm.
One of the committees that I'm on, so I'm on a thing called the Church Buildings Council, which is a national body for the Church of England, which does casework and policy, which is really interesting. A subcommittee of that is a thing called the Statutory Advisory Committee for Closed and Closing Churches. It's a bit of a mouthful. And that's the committee through which Anglican churches that the diocese wants to close, they pass through that committee, and the committee's job is to not to say yes or no, that's not our role. It's to comment on what would be an appropriate future for the building, which ranges from, at the top end, this is a really important building that must pass to the CCT, the Churches Conservation Trust, or so that's called last resort vesting. So the building gets vested, it gets deconsecrated and vested in a effectively a preservation trust type situation. Doesn't have to be the CCT, but that's the one that was set up around 1970 to deal with churches. They have about 350 odd churches, so former church buildings, and just occasionally they manage to get those buildings back into church use, so they can go in the opposite direction, which is an interesting thing. So the SAC has last resort vesting as sort of the top end of the recommendation. At the bottom end is it's fine to demolish it, there are modern church buildings that close that have no architectural merit to them at all. And if they don't lend themselves to conversion, then well, yes, fine. We don't object to them being demolished. And then in between, there's sort of, well, yeah, we could see this becoming a house. So things like different uses imply different degrees of alteration. So, a house clearly needs some fully enclosed spaces. So how does that work with, a particular building? There might be good
Mm.
ways of doing that in a building that doesn't harm its significance, whatever that might be. And
Mm.
other buildings, you just don't want to do that. So you want a use that would keep it as a single space. It still reads as it originally was.
Has there been, it was interesting you say that the field workers off season would maintain the church and
Mm.
they would maintain the church with lime, using lime.
Mhm.
So it's a combination lack of maintenance over the last 30, 40, 50 years, potentially.
Mhm.
And also, when did can you see the introduction of cementitious mortars being introduced? What period are we looking at? Is it the 50s, the 60s, the 70s? Because up until that point, if they've been regularly maintained, and
Mhm.
possibly I would imagine that if these field workers were maintaining the churches, they're probably doing it because they're part of the parish and it's sort of
Yes.
it's recognized that they should be doing it for
Yeah.
either free or a small amount of
Yeah.
money.
Yeah.
But it would be such an important building in that parish that it would have the maintenance, it would have the care and the love.
You like to
When
think,
do you
yes.
see this drop off? When do you see that? And because that's now we must have a huge amount of Victorian facades, whether they're
Hmm.
upgrades from a medieval building, but there
Hmm.
must be a huge amount of Victorian, that 100-year period where all of a
Hmm.
sudden, wow, we're crunch time now. We're seeing some
Hmm.
severe damage,
Hmm.
lack of maintenance, and the
Hmm.
use of cementitious
Hmm.
mortars.
So various things there. So the sort of crunch situation. Um, so Victorian churches, the crunch situation on a Victorian church would much more likely happen with respect to its roof than its walls. So
Okay,
because the roof is
that's
something that
interesting.
do you basically need to do kind of all at once if you're going to do, if it's going to be more than sort of running repairs. And
Mm,
a roof would have, all of the slates would be failing. If they're going to fail, it'll be a function of age and exposure to, heating and cooling, whatever. So it's sort of likely to happen in a wave. Um, the maintenance of wall, the pointing on a wall, whether it's a brick wall or a masonry wall, um, will be something that starts earlier, I guess, in the life of the building and is much more of a sort of continuous thing than, I mean, a roof will need somebody to get up and, refix a slat or a tile or a slate,
mm.
but I think there's something qualitatively different in terms of the homegrown community taking responsibility for the maintenance of the building and doing the repointing. That as an understanding seems to have carried on, let's say, certainly sort of through to the mid 20th century, overlapping with the introduction of this wonderful new material, the ordinary Portland cement, which you can just go down to the builders and buy, building merchant
Yeah.
and get.
Mm.
So I see. So there's a phase in which you have the old mechanism of maintenance tied to the new material being used in a way that's not understood why that's a bad idea. And it's a bad idea because the cement doesn't breathe and it's too strong for the
Mm.
masonry units. It causes masonry units to be wetter and therefore suffer frost damage because it's not breathing through the joints, which are meant to be the sacrificial bit. That's the mechanism. And so you've got this overlap of new technology with old understanding, which leads to quite a lot of cementitious pointing. So I'm guessing 50% of the churches that I inspect, because there's a 5 yearly inspection regime, quinquennial inspections, um, they probably 50% have some cementitious pointing, probably more actually. So the people, well-meaning people have been doing that. And sometimes, I mean, you would always advise against it. Sometimes it actually doesn't matter that much. The
Mm,
building will, in time, the building will shed that pointing as the wall is absorbing thermal movement. Gradually, it will shed it, and that'll be fine. If the stones, particularly if it's a stone building and the stones are hard enough, if it's field stones that are nice and hard, then they're not going to deteriorate with that moisture mechanism. But there are lots of cases where actually the masonry units, brick or stone, are deteriorating because of the mortar. And then you've got a choice between actually you look at it and you think, is it better to try and remove it with some consequential damage as you do because the material is sticking, well to the masonry units, or is it something that is better just to sort of leave now that it's there, let's not disturb it, let's just monitor it type
mm.
situation. So there's quite a lot of it around. There's probably three-quarters of the buildings I look at, actually, thinking about it. It's very common. And there's a thing about so I'm all in favor of the sort of voice of the parish in conservation decision making. The part of the reason the voice of the parish has been marginalized is because the parish, in inverted commas, has been going around doing the cement pointing. So the professionals that come along say, look what happens when you let the parish do their own thing. Now,
Yeah, yeah.
we can. I think it's beholden on us to guide the parish in how to do it well, and to point out the dangers. The other situation, similar situation that you come across, you know, no medieval church has a damp-proof course, in its walls. It doesn't have a damp-proof membrane in its floor. So depending upon the overall dampness of the soil around it, it might be, it's a building that is dealing with moisture in a different way to the modern thing, which is to seal it out effectively. Um,
Mm,
and so sometimes you get quite a lot of moisture in the lower part of walls, and sometimes, quite often, you see, and this might be, I don't know, a quarter or a fifth or a tenth, I don't know, of the buildings I look at have had somebody come along putting either sort of gypsum plaster, hacking off plaster at low level, which has probably failed, the lime plaster, and again putting in nice new material, readily available from the builder's merchant. It might be cement render with a skim coat on it, but thinking of it as a modern thing. And of course,
mm,
what that does is just drive the moisture further up the wall. It pops out where it has the opportunity for the wall to breathe. So you end up with a high tide mark, above where you've re-plastered to. You then get the moisture coming out. So
mm.
there's modern materials need to be used with caution, but there are times to use modern materials with historic buildings. But you've got to have a good understanding of how the thing is working as a system, as a building system, um,
Yes, yeah,
not
exactly.
just the individual tasks that you've got in front of you. That's
Yeah.
9 times out of 10. That's where we go wrong. We don't think wide enough. And when I say we, that's the people of the parish doing the wrong thing, historically anyway. But it's also the conservation professionals. We focus too much on an individual task and miss the big picture.
Mm.
So yeah, it's understanding the system as a whole, and that in addressing the conservation professionals, that's the system as a whole means not only the constructional system, but as coming back to the point of living heritage being the nexus of people and place, it's how the people are working with the building, the whole thing, as a proposition, which is the bit that almost always gets left out by the conservation professionals.
Mm, mm. And how do you fare with heated debates? Because I would imagine, I'm just thinking, there must be, you must have this all the time where there's a lot of deep discussion and it must get quite heated at some stage because there's so many people, people in the decision, aren't there?
Mhm, mhm.
And it must be incredibly difficult you'd be passionate about what you feel is right for the building, but
Mhm. Mhm.
somebody else might be completely
Yeah.
disagreeing, and then you're at loggerheads. And
Yeah.
tell me a bit more about that because I'm interested in how that
So
works.
yes, so the within the church system, um, with a controversial, with a more ambitious change
Mm,
proposal to a historic building, almost always you will have a meeting on site, having the church having decided what they want to do, and do you really want to do this? And this is going to be more difficult as a heritage ask than this bit over here. But sort of once there's a settled scheme, and the church has drafted its statements of significance and statements of needs. So that's the what's important about the building, what's the public benefit that we're waiting. Those two documents are essentially what the decision maker, the chancellor, weighs up one against the other. Once those are in draft form, you then tend to, and you've done some liaison with the DAC, who've probably done a visit with representatives, and they've helped sort of shape and manage the thing. You then have a public consultation stage, which by public it's statutory consultees. I mean, there should also be public consultation with your community to make sure that you've
Mm.
got broad community support. That's really helpful and good to be able to demonstrate. But the you end up with a 9 times out of 10 you end up with a meeting. So the relevant amenity societies. So we've got 6 amenity societies, national amenity societies. The ones that tend to attend meetings, depending upon the nature of the building, would be SPAD, dealing with anything pre 1700, Georgian Group, Victorian Society, and the 20th Century Society. Those would be the ones. So it's perfectly possible to have all of those. You've then got a couple more, including what's now called Historic Buildings and Places, used to be the Ancient Monument Society. They sometimes attend. So they plus quite likely Historic England case officer will attend. So you can have a meeting where you've got up to half a dozen of these independent voices, and
Mm.
it can be like herding cats. So and
Yeah.
representatives from the DAC will be there. So it can be quite a large meeting. It can be 20 people. You'll have representatives of the church. You really want the archdeacon there, who's a sort of at the level below the bishop, who will hopefully be able to sort of help manage the meeting. But quite often it's down to me as the architect to try and manage that meeting on behalf of the church. So it often starts with the church saying something briefly about this is our situation, and this is why we're wanting to do what we're doing, and then the architect explaining this is the nature of the proposal, and everybody's sort of looking around and looking at stuff and trying to asking questions about the proposal, and then there's a sort of comment part to the meeting, and then generally speaking, those people go away and have a committee to whom they need to report. So it's generally sort of officers of the respective organizations who then need to go away and get the say-so from a committee, and then you get some written feedback. Those meetings can be quite feisty.
Yeah.
And it comes down always, in my experience, it comes down to a basic disagreement about what conservation is about between preservation
Exactly. Yeah.
and letting the thing live and breathe and
Mm.
continue growing. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Um, with all your experience, everything that all the churches that you've been involved with, all the decision making, if somebody was to say to you, Nigel, give me three key points or key factors how we can maintain, keep our churches going with various changes, but the survival of our churches, what would you say that would be the fundamentals that need to be implemented that maybe aren't being
Mm.
implemented at the moment?
So yeah, so I suppose that the sort of what are the fundamental problems? So trying to work around to an answer. I suppose problem number one is I'm not sure I'll get as far as three. Problem
No,
number
no, you probably
one,
won't. That was
problem
probably a bit
num
harsh on me.
no 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 no. Problem number one is a disengagement between the people in the building, and sometimes that's the conservation process has played a role in that, which has been really unhelpful by making it difficult in a way that it needn't have been. And
Mm.
and a sort of overall overarching aim for me, having done the conservation bit and where I'm coming from, where I find myself working, is to improve the relationship between the people who use the building and the building so that they appreciate it and don't see it because it's very
Mm,
common for churches to see their historic building as a problem as opposed to seeing it as an opportunity and a privilege. So I get involved in theological arguments about, and sometimes I write about this, and I talk to another of the things I do. I talk to ordinands who are preparing for ordination. They're going through the training process, and the people who end up, once they're sort of fully vicars, they may end up being responsible for an absolutely extraordinary Grade One listed medieval building. You know,
mm.
and almost none of them have any experience of historic buildings at all. I mean, they just don't, they don't know where to start. And I say to them, you need to treat these buildings with respect, because if you don't, then they have the capacity to destroy you, in terms of, because they will suck all the energy out of your ministry as a vicar if you don't treat
How
them
do you mean?
well.
How do you mean? Elaborate on that.
So if you don't treat a building well, so simple thing, you don't maintain it. If you
I
treat
see. I
it
see. Yeah.
just as something that's there and will look after itself,
Mm,
then it will surprise you in a bad
mm,
way.
mm.
But also
Okay.
that there's a positive side to that, which is that it's a huge opportunity as if most churches want to serve their communities and reach out to people. And they Johnny well should be. It's not meant to be a private members club. Though interestingly, in some cases, and particularly in other denominations, that's kind of the understanding. It's a private members club, which is really that's another layer of problem. But
Mm,
within the Anglican Church, which is the majority of what we do, that's less common. It's still there sometimes, less common. Um, but you have this extraordinary asset, which is, I mean, so it's about what heritage is and how heritage is relevant to people who have no interest in religious faith, let's say, but actually there are a lot of people in our culture who want rootedness because they want belonging, they want to feel placed
mm.
because those are the things that modernity has taken away from us. We no longer nearly so often are born into a community, grow up in it, stay in that community all our lives. And,
No.
so the 200, 300 years ago, it would be relatively common, one presumes, certainly before the railways, where, people would literally, never, there would be people who would never have gone outside their, 5 mile radius or whatever, because
Yes.
everything
Yeah.
happens locally. That's clearly not the case anymore for the vast, vast majority of people. Um, and we are far more rootless and heritage, particularly community heritage, the church having been created in some sense, at least, there might have been a patron, but in some sense by the community, owned by the community, responsibility taken by the community for this building that sort of represents the community. You see previous generations of the community memorialized on the, and the walls and the, various memorials and in the churchyard. It's something that shouts community, or it should do, but if the church is sort of presenting itself as a private members religious club, then it's going to be pushing. So the building, to me, in this is a theological argument, as I say, about mission. It enables a church to engage with people around it who wouldn't have other reasons to do it because they've sort of discounted the religious bit.
Mm,
So it's just a way of trying to persuade churches to engage positively with what they've got and use it. And that's good for everybody. It's heritage engagement is the Heritage Lottery Fund, would be delighted. The more of that you can do and demonstrate, the better. So in terms and other funding bodies, they want to see community engagement. And you've got this fantastic opportunity in your historic building with so many stories around it, stories of interesting people, stories of disaster when the tower fell down, I've got one church where the tower fell down, but actually it was a early 20th century. A plane flew into it, and the tower collapsed. So the tower was rebuilt. All of this sort of
Mm.
thing. You get, yeah. There's just a wealth of opportunity there if you are willing to, as a church, to engage with it creatively. Um, so it's trying to reframe churches in that positive sense to enable that, encourage that.
And are there any other opportunities you feel that the church could, because ultimately, somebody has to pay for this maintenance and the upkeep, so that's costly. Are there any other ways of income that you feel that churches could to adopt potentially that may be a bit contentious as well, and
Mm,
people might disagree and say this is not what we're
mm,
not what we stand for. However,
mm.
times are different. Things are a lot more expensive.
Yeah. So there's yes, there's a whole sort of grants structure. So um, churches are able to raise money through grant funding.
Mm.
That's a different sort of thing. It's great and it's really worthwhile. And I chair the grants committee for the National Churches Trust, and we give away multiple hundreds of thousands of pounds 3 times a year to churches across the 4 nations of the UK, all denominations. They don't have to be listed. We can fund ugly churches as well. We're looking for community sort of benefit and yeah, so there is money available, but the money, for example, that organization is able to give away is a drop in the bucket in terms of what's needed.
Mm.
And in any case, we shouldn't be a church that doesn't need can raise money without relying on grants is in a much stronger position in life anyway, than one that has no fundraising capacity left. So, in terms of the things that churches can do that will bring in some money, so it might be concerts, for example. Um,
Yes. Yeah.
it's really helpful and healthy, I think, when a church sets up or a community sets up a friends group. So you get
Mm.
friends of St. Thomas's or whatever it is, which will be a group of people who are interested in the building that probably aren't interested in it as a church in terms of religious function, but just see it as something really important, anchoring the community.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
There's a fierce loyalty from many people who would consider themselves secular towards church buildings. It's very common, and again, something that the church should be doing everything it can to sort of animate that and help that come forward. So having a friends group that will do their own fundraising, and often there's a division. I think the typical pattern is that the friends group will pay for repairs and sort of keeping the show on the road, while the congregation pay for the ministry within the building. That will be a typical sort of division when it's working well. And then there's stuff, that churches can sometimes develop a program of activities that will draw in money, sometimes. But it's quite difficult to get the building to pay for itself. So ultimately there's always an element of parish giving, people giving, giving money, and that's part of the challenge is that perhaps there's less of a culture of that than there used to be. Um, generally in terms of you go to church and you put money in the collection plate, which is now probably electronic. The card, you tap the card reader,
Oh yeah. Of
direct
course, you're gonna
debit.
tap, aren't you?
Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
Interesting, and part of my role, and again, things that have come about since I did the doctorate. I'm involved with conservation internationally, and I was asked to go to Finland just last month to talk to some people. And so there, as in common with various other countries, Germany, for example, they still have church tax. So if you haven't resigned from being a member of in that case, the Lutheran Church, then you pay, I don't know, sort of 1% of your income gets collected and given to the church. Uh,
Mm.
Now we've not had that anything like that system in Britain from I don't know whether I suppose it was the tithe system. So before, I suppose it's through the 19th century, there were still tithes being paid, I guess. I don't know when it stopped. But the financial situation of the church at the local level in a place like that in Finland is completely different from the way it is in England. So yeah, it's different models in different places.
Mm. Now, isn't there an opportunity, and I don't know if this is happening yet, but there seems to be a golden opportunity for churches to become possibly training centers for
Yeah.
craftspeople
Yeah.
that could possibly be supported by the government. I don't know.
Hmm.
But however, if you think of how many churches are in disrepair
Mm.
and they need carpenters, they need roofers, they need
Mm.
stonemasons, it almost seems that we have these buildings that need to
Mm.
be conserved and restored. It's a shame there's not a program.
Yes. Yes. So I mean, in order for there to be a program, you need, again, this is sort of long-term and strategic thinking, so thinking outside one's immediate pressing needs. You know, where does the infrastructure for such a system come from? So one, I think, the government would probably say it's down to the industry. So, a stonemason having a structure that, brings apprentices through, for example. Um,
Mm.
there or it's you go to stonemason school for some time and you learn something there and then through apprenticeship. In terms of you can't an individual church couldn't sort of collect a couple of people who want to become, want to work with timber and set them loose on, sort of repairing something. That they need to be doing that in the context of somebody with existing
Mm.
skills, who therefore
Yes.
needs to be either, compensated for that or see it as sufficiently strategic, in terms of growing the next generation. But there's absolutely right. We are running low on skilled craftsmen, and where are they
Mm.
going to come from? And, so that, I mean, that speaks to a much larger discussion as to the way Britain values or not, craft skills and anything you do with your hands, it has a lower respectability than stuff you do with your head, which is,
Yeah, but that's going to change very, very quickly, Nigel, with the world of AI, which is going to be
well, interesting.
nipping at
Yes.
our heels very, very quickly because
Yes.
all of a sudden there'll be, there will be quite a lot of people that are unemployed, and the things that AI cannot take away
Mm.
from us are craft skills and people that
Yes.
work with their
Yes.
hands.
Yes.
So
Yes. The
there, I think there's
general
going to
advice
be
is become a plumber, I think is the,
Exactly. So that
yeah.
there are going to be a lot of people that hands-on work
Mm.
available, and all of a sudden, as you say, it's always the era that we've worked in. It's always the tradespeople have to doff their cap to, the people that work in the city, and they're always the
Mm.
sort of almost like a second-class citizen.
Yeah.
I think the tables are going to turn now,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so there could be a positive that's coming out of
Mm.
this situation that we find ourselves in the next few
Mm.
years, and
Mm.
I think not only could, if there was a program set up, obviously it has to be, there's people like myself, like you, that are, we're sort of coming towards the tail end of our
Mhm.
career. Now, why couldn't we, people like us, there's so many of my colleagues that are late 50s, early 60s that are on the verge of retirement, and they have so many skills.
Mm.
Individuals like that could be involved in these
Mm.
programs. So,
Mhm.
to teaching the youngsters, because if it was predominantly on churches, there's still, once they learn how to do various sort of aspects and skills within the church, they can then take that and use it on a period property. And then you
Mm.
have the whole
Mhm. Mm.
sustainability thing that's moving. So, that's, it could be very, that could be, yeah, it needs to be organized. I don't have the time to organize it. I don't know if you do, but.
Mm. No, no. But one interesting thing, different, not at all the same, but one interesting thing we had. one, in fact, a set of, I think, three churches, four churches, and somebody who had the responsibility. Basically, he was sort of the buildings man, and he himself is retired, so it's not about bringing on the next generation. But he was saying, kind of, you talk about Lyme, kind of, where can I learn this? And we ended up
Mm,
setting him up just for half a day or a day with one of the people that, one of the contractors that was, doing a lot of line work, and he had some stuff. I think it was possibly even at Ely Cathedral at the time. He said, "Yeah, yeah, let him come, and I'll show him how to do it." And
right.
he's taken that skill away, and so that's an example of the skill getting put back into the parish, as it were. Now, in that case, it's not the 25-year-old, it's the 65-year-old, or whatever he might be. But it's still,
Yeah.
I think, a really healthy thing. And what you really long for is for the 65-year-old then to find the 25-year-old and pass the skill on locally. That's what you would hope for. I
Yes.
I don't know whether there's any such idea, but that's what I'd love to see.
Yeah. Because as you say, we used to stay in our villages and our parishes.
Mm,
And so that was automatically just handed down. Just, but
mm.
now people are just so sporadic. They go,
Yes,
and
yes, yeah,
that's, unfortunately, that doesn't happen anymore.
yeah.
So we're coming towards the end, Nigel, but I'm really interested to find out from you what your sort of, you probably have many, but one of your favorite projects,
Mm,
the one that really, really, I don't know, gave you inspiration, or
mm,
yeah, tell us a little bit about that particular project, or there may be two or three, but
mm. So there's, I suppose, a couple of, on the face of it, similar projects, both to large Grade One listed medieval churches,
mm,
both within about 15-mile radius of where we're based, both within Ely Diocese. One is the church in Ely itself. So Ely has one major parish church alongside the extraordinary cathedral. Um, it's called St Mary's, and a couple of years ago we did very substantial alterations there. So that was a building that was used basically half a day a week, with some attached halls, later 20th century halls at the back, which were used more, but the church itself not, apart from for worship. And it was as the Victorians pretty much had left it. A few little changes, but all pews. And that's now we took out all the pews bar three or four that had kept as a sort of sample of what was there. We put in new floor, underfloor heating, air source heat pumps, and various other changes. And that's now a building that's used 7 days a week. And by my key metric, so two key metrics. One is it in use? Yes, it is in use, and therefore it's going to survive. That's kind of that's kind of the sort of thing. And the relationship between the people and the building is a whole lot better than it was. And the relationship between the people of the church and the people around the church in the community is also better because more people in the community are coming in for more things. So all of
mm,
that is just beautiful, and I'm really, really proud of that. Um, there's another project. The other one is in this village, Bassingbourne, which I mentioned before, and that was a painful experience in terms of getting permission. Quite, really bruising. There was quite a lot of unhappiness about what was being proposed in terms of the building from some people within the local community. Others very supportive, but some people. And the bit about the ecclesiastical exemption, the faculty system that I didn't talk about was that when you get a sort of something that is potentially sort of disputed, then you get a what's termed a consistory court, which is literally the holding of a court, but it's an ecclesiastical court instead of a civil court. But it's presided over by the judge, and it's gowns and it's wigs and it's all rise please, and kind of all of that
mm,
sort of thing. It takes place within the church. You have witnesses for and against, get cross-examination of witnesses, and I was a witness there because we'd designed the scheme, for the church, and I had people trying to traduce my reputation, shall we say. which was a really
I
interesting.
like that. Reduced.
Well, yes, or traduce. Yeah. I mean, it was an ad hominem attack, really, sadly.
Okay.
Anyway, they ended up getting permission. The getting of the money in order to do that was in back in 2018, 2017, 18. The getting of the money in order to do the work. They had a decent wad of money, but they didn't have the money they needed, has taken most of the time since. And that's still on site and will hopefully complete by the end of the year. That's one that I just because of the scars acquired in achieving the permission, that's
Mm,
one that I just will, rejoice in when it's finished. There's another one that's interesting. I mean, we do stuff. We've done in a couple of colleges. We've done programs of accessibility works. Um, so Ridley Hall, which is one of the theological colleges in Cambridge, did a whole lot of. And so that's quite a different sort of building. It's grade two listed Victorian buildings, so 1870s. Um, and as part of, so they were in a situation where they had, their main communal facilities were all of them inaccessible in terms of, level access and wheelchairs and whatever. And the worst of them was the library, which is on the second floor. And even if you could get a lift up there, you couldn't then move around. It was really tight and difficult. And the library is a pretty important part of their community and their communal life. So that was a scheme that both provided sort of ramps and to entrances because with Victorian buildings the levels are all over the place. Often, they
yeah.
just weren't thinking the same way. And the library issue was sorted out by taking one of the basements and lowering the basement to create the sufficient headroom to create the library. And there's an external lift that goes down to that. So that was a really interesting thing where you had to think sideways to get to a good solution. There's another one, last one I'll talk about. So in one of the other colleges in Cambridge, which has taken, so it's taken over part of what they had as under freehold, but there was a leasehold to another theological college which gave up their facility. They didn't need it anymore. That included a 1920s chapel, but the college already has a chapel and all of that stuff. They didn't need another chapel. They didn't need another performance space. So the proposal, which we'll have to see how it flies with the local conservation officer still, the proposal is to use the space and some adjacent spaces to create a college archive because at the moment they've got some really important documents going back to before 1500. And some of those documents are in basements that could flood, and it's just not as and in split into just where there is available storage across the college. So it's to try and so the public benefit, which I will be talking about with the conservation officer, is there's a very significant public benefit in being able to bring all this stuff together into one place
Mm.
where it's going to be properly managed, climate controlled and so on. But that's a really interesting spin on, so quite different from working with a church community with the sort of typical problems that they have. But all the time, it's trying to do the right thing by the building while allowing it to change. There's an idea within conservation about tolerance for change, assessing, not saying no to change, not trying to reduce change to a minimum, but just looking for where are the places within a given building that are more tolerant to change without compromising the significance of the building. So
Mm.
this is, that's an exercise in testing those limits, and we'll see how that conversation goes.
It's amazing. You must get inundated with inquiries and work. And it must be difficult because you probably can't take on everything unless you keep expanding your practice.
Mm,
But the other thing is, it sounds fascinating because you're you're constantly learning. You're constantly, it's
mm, mm,
problem solving, isn't it?
mm,
Problem
mm,
solving on another level.
mm,
And it must be, if you're anything like me, you wake up in the middle of the night and think, oh, I know, yeah, we could do this, we could do that. And then all of a sudden your
mm,
mind's racing and you can't get back
mm,
to
mm,
sleep
mm,
because it takes such a lot of energy and thought your line of work. It must be
Mm,
absolutely fascinating. You're never going to get bored, Nigel.
mm. Absolutely. And the AI discussion, it's you can't do that by AI. I cannot believe that AI can ever do
No,
the picking
no,
picking a problem apart in a strategic way and creatively solving it in a way that balances
no.
all the, because there's too many moving parts. I like to think anyway. Just another example, the Bassingbourn example, in terms of sort of areas of interest, Bassingbourn happens to have surviving and these are in the Cambridgeshire Archive, church wardens accounts from 1496 to 1540.
Oh,
He
lovely.
published. And so I was reading through some of that stuff, and again, it's really interesting. So the sort of things that we are looking to do to that building, I mean, that's happening, but trying to justify it elsewhere in terms of bringing
Mm,
community use into these buildings, it is basically it's a reintroduction of something that was there that got thrown out of the building because most of these, at least in village situations, most of these churches would originally, if you go back far enough into the Middle Ages, have been the only community building in the thing. And so, of course, all those different things happen. So, in the case of Bassingbourn, it's clear that there's a sort of South Chapel, end of the South Aisle. That was the schoolroom. There's a plan that proves that that was the schoolroom in
oh, lovely.
so just as an example of, why should you be, doing things that aren't worship in a church? Well, that's the way it always was. So
Yes.
changed from it, and
Yeah.
we need to change back to it.
Yeah, you can imagine, that you could have a church that has, a village shop bolted onto the side of and a library and yeah, because that's going to bring people in. That
Yes,
will absolutely bring people in.
there are examples of all of those. So in Herefordshire, there's a church called St Leonard's, I think it is Yarpole, a little
Mm.
village called Yarpole, which the shop had closed. They set up a community shop in a container, and then they did a scheme to the church, which has put in a shop and post office at the back of the church, within it, and it's great. It's fantastic. It gives the building is being used and therefore will survive.
Yeah,
That's
and like you say, even if you're not religious, there are very few people that want to see their lovely parish church
exactly.
go to rack and
Yeah.
ruin,
Yeah.
and they're very protective about it. So
Mm.
therefore, if it wasn't just worship only, and there are other elements, that's
Mhm.
got to be the way forward, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. I think so. And that requires, again, it comes back to it requires change from the people in the church in terms of what they think they have and are managing and what they're about. And it requires change from conservation gatekeepers who
Mm,
need to again just reimagine what conservation is and what churches are. In a sense, it's very simple.
yes, but it's must be just difficult. It's a bit like turning an oil tanker around,
Yes,
because
yes,
there are people are very, very set in their ways, and that's how
yes.
it's got to be. However, the things have changed on it, and they continue to change on such a fast rate
Mm,
that we haven't really got time to be thinking of, oh, that's how we used to do it, and that's how we're going to continue to do it, because it's a
yeah,
very different world now. And
yes, yes, yes.
yeah, it's interesting. And out of interest for people that would be interested in getting into your particular expertise and profession, what would you recommend where they can go, resources, websites?
Um, so good question. So there's a sort of there's a national and an international part of that. So uh, and of course it depends where people are starting from. If they're starting from being an architect or other buildings professional, then working a way towards accreditation, conservation accreditation, I think would be a priority. One of the other things I do, I'm an assessor on the RIBA accreditation scheme, which again is fascinating to see how people have gained the experience they need in order to become independent authorities. Essentially, it's a test of the accreditation is a test of the ability to act independently and responsibly and with authority. Um,
Mm,
and you demonstrate that through a number of case studies. But of course, in order to have case studies of work to historic buildings, you need to be somewhere that you're doing that work. And that generally means finding a practice to work for that will be able to give you that experience. So personally, part of the what I see my practice Archangel being about is being an environment in which people can learn that and and grow and acquire that authority. Um,
mm,
and yeah, we've succeeded. I mean, obviously, it's on a small scale. In terms of resources to look for, I'm a big fan. There's a thing, I think it's buildingconservation.com, maybe, that there's a series of publications that around conservation so they've got a historic churches one and but others as well. And they take their art, so it's a paper publication still. They take their articles from that and they have in a repository as where you can go and find it. That's a really useful place to look. Um,
yeah. That's the Buildings Conservation Directory.
yes,
Is that
that's
the
right.
one? Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. Um, Internationally, so I'm involved internationally with ICOMOS, the International Council of Monuments and Sites. So, kind of international conservation. But I help to run one of the international scientific committees. They're called on theory and philosophy. We do conferences. So there's stuff being published out of things like that. There are also publications following they have general assemblies, which are bigger events each year, and then a big one every 3 years. So people write for those sorts of things. So that there's quite a lot there. The ICOMOS has recently redone its website, and there's quite a lot of material visible there. I mean, aside from anything, if one wants to get into this thing, particularly if one wants to get into the nuances of the process that conservation operates under, then familiarity with the different charters, the conservation charters, and so on, like the Venice Charter, for example, much discussed, never revised. Whole interesting story around that. The NARA document on authenticity being a kind of key term. So all of that sort of stuff can be found at that sort of international level. You'll be able to track that stuff down. Ultimately, I recommend anybody. So I'm thinking conservation architect type people, or more general cultural heritage management stuff. Doing a master's is a really good way. Hopefully, affordable enough to be able to, kind of perhaps do it alongside work as I did it. And it's a way of getting some proper input as opposed to, it's a really interesting mix, conservation, in terms of, conservation professionals. Many conservation professionals have essentially learnt their craft, and I think it is a craft, through apprenticeship with somebody, more senior. You join a practice and you gain
Mhm.
experience and whatever, which is fantastic. And I would say that's in a sense that's a weakness of my experience in that that's not how I came through it. I came through a different route as I've described. So that's great. But if that was all there was, the discipline would never move forward, which it blooming well needs to, because that's sort of a closed system. It's very easy to settle into an understanding of this is what it's about and this is the way we do things, and that to simply get replicated generation by generation.
Mm.
So having some academic input through a well-run master's program, for example, really helpful. I
Yeah,
would
yeah.
say I would say increasingly important actually as time goes on.
Great. Thank you. We'll include all the links in our show notes. So, Nigel, it's been a pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you very, very much for your time. And I've learnt an awful lot. It's not something I know, and I haven't really worked on many churches at all, actually. So it's been fascinating for me to hear your stories and your expertise, and your passion really comes across. So it's been fantastic today. So thank you very much. But before we go, could you say to where our listeners can find more about you and what you do, your practice, and yeah, and we'll also put those links down below as well.
Thank you. So the practice is Archangel. We're based near Cambridge. The website is archangelarchitects.co.uk. So ARCH, Angel Architects, all one word. There's also, if you're particularly interested in church stuff, we've got a resource sort of website called churchbuildingprojects.co.uk. That's aimed at churches. It's just resources that aim to help churches, do a better job as we've described. There's also, in terms of my academic stuff, there's a list of publications on the Archangel site, my part of that. There's also, if you're familiar with academia.edu, that's where a lot of them can be downloaded from or pointed towards. Yeah.
Wonderful. Great. Well, it's been really interesting, and it must be such an interesting and fascinating space to be in, because it's constantly evolving.
Yeah.
And yeah, really enjoyed today's conversation. So thank you.
As have I. Thank you. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot. And hopefully we will catch up soon. But for now, it's been a real pleasure. And thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Vincent. Brilliant.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.